What I would like to do is begin with prayer and then read the text, and then we will start the message. So let's pray. Father in heaven, one of the things we've been commanded to do and exhorted to do as we gather together as your people is to give ourselves to the public reading of Scripture, and we do that in many ways here, but one of the ways we do it is giving ourselves to the explanation of your word, to the reading of your word. And so as we're about to do that, I ask for great grace. I ask even at the very beginning of the message, as we just read the text, that you would quicken it to our hearts, cause us to see things and realize things for the first time, and to begin to be gripped with the things we read here, that the message that follows would penetrate deeply and be memorable and lasting. We know this is eternal seed that we're casting here and handling, and so we're warranted to look for an everlasting and fruit from it, that it would bear fruit on into eternity. And so we seek that from you for every heart that's here. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of the month every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses, for if anyone eats what is leavened, from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on these days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin, none of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, "What do you mean by this service?" you shall say, "It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses." And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so, as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord, as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 400 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired servant may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. But he shall be as a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine." Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey. You shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you. No leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. You shall tell your son on that day, 'It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.' And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first opened the womb, but all the firstborns of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand, or frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. All right. Well, that's a mouthful for sure. I hope you notice something happening over and over again in that passage that I read. Happened 3 times. But we'll get to that in a moment. The title of the message today is A Day of Significance. A Day of Significance. There are several reasons we could call the Passover night and the day that followed, that whole 24 hours, a night of significance or a day of significance. First, there is the death of the firstborn. This is just one thing, but you could almost break it down into 3 significant parts. The son of Pharaoh, the firstborn son of Pharaoh dies. The firstborn of all the livestock of Egypt die. The firstborn sons of all the houses of the Egyptians die. Those are significant things. Second, there is the passing over of the Israelite houses from this visitation of death. That's massively significant. Third, there is the deliverance of the Israelites out of Egypt on the same day. It all happened in one day, right? That's massively significant. Fourth, there is the way that Pharaoh and the Egyptians almost drove out the Israelites after having refused them for so long. For so long their stance was, no, you won't go. And now it's, get out, go, leave. Those are significant things. All of these are very significant acts, whereby I mean they are important turning points in the story and in the life of Israel. But today, when I say this day was a day of significance, I mean to use that word in a slightly different way. I mean significance according to another dictionary definition of that term, another usage of that term. That is, this is a day that is signified. It's a day of significance in that way. Significance can mean something that is conveyed as a meaning, often obscurely or indirectly. Right? If I do one thing and it signifies something else, it's an indirect way of telling you something else. And this is a day of significance. This is a day that is proclaimed as the significance in 3 other things that happens. God gives Israel 3 customs or laws or commands, you could say, to practice perpetually throughout their generation. And all 3 of them signify things that happen on this one day. So it's a day of great significance because there are so many things in Israel's life that point to it. It is signified in this custom. It is signified in this other custom. It is signified in another. And that's what I mean. Suppose I went to a family gathering and this happened. Historically, this happened. Let me say, it's not something that's going to happen. We don't intend, we don't think. It's something that did happen in the past. Suppose I went to a family gathering and took my 1-year-old son and dressed him in a shirt that said only child, which was then scratched out and had the words Big Brother written below, right? Suppose I then let him loose to play and mingle as though nothing was any different, and a few minutes later someone reads his shirt. What do you think is the significance of those actions? I haven't said anything, but we have signified something important, right? I'm telling them, or my wife is telling them, her family, right? Something about her condition. and our expectations for what will happen in a few more months. That is, she is pregnant, and in a few more months we expect that this boy will not just be an only child, but will be a big brother. So the meaning has to do with the pregnancy, but it was conveyed in a very indirect manner. It was signified. The pregnancy was signified in the shirt. Likewise, in these 2 chapters, Israel is given a number of indirect signifiers about what will be its history. They're supposed to be doing something all the time, every year, and then every time there's someone born, that will do these things that will have certain significance to them, will carry meaning, which will remind them of something in their history. It hasn't happened yet. It's about to happen, and God is telling them how He wants them to do things before it happens. How He wants them to remember what hasn't happened yet. It's an odd thing, you know. It's just anyway. It's a curious situation we find ourselves in. The people are given certain practices which they are to keep throughout their future existence as a nation. And these practices are meant to communicate in an indirect but very clear manner the central emphasis of what happened on a single day in their history. Israel is given 3 practices in these 2 chapters: the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the redemption of the firstborn. 3 things. Each of these customs are directly connected to the events of this night and day of the Passover. So my goal today is to discuss these customs as they relate to the events of this night, and to make sure we also understand the central emphasis that God gives to this deliverance of His people. What are the things that He wanted them to be telling their children? Notice in each one of these 3 things, it's told to us, and when your son asks, or when your children ask, what do you mean by this strange custom? You should tell them. So what is it God wants us to be telling our kids? What does He want us to understand? We're not going to live in Israel doing these practices. Like, we don't do this every year. When's the last Passover you had? How many of your firstborn sons have been redeemed? The answer, none of you. We don't do this. We're not the nation of Israel. But they had this practice because God wanted to remind them continually about what He had done for them as a nation. It was important that they understood these things. So I hope this makes sense. What I'm saying is that God acted in a magnificent way on this day in history. And before He acted, right before He acted, He gave instructions to the people to perpetually keep 3 new customs for their entire future as a nation. And while giving them instructions about these strange new customs, He told them about future conversations they would and should have with their children years in the future, in which they should explain that these new customs signify the most important points for them to remember about this day of deliverance. So, I would count this message as a success if, after listening to it, you're able to do 2 main things. First, if you could state in your own words the way in which each of these 3 customs signified the deliverance of Israel out of Egypt. Could you tell me how the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the redemption of the firstborn signify what God did for the people of Israel? And the second thing, which would be a success, would be if you can understand clearly how these 3 ideas come together to teach us about God and about redemption. Can we do those 2 things? So, that's what we're going to do today. So let's just begin with the Passover. I'm not going to read every one of the verses about the Passover. Again, we're not going to do that, but I want to speak to us about it. First of all, the Passover is what happens, right, when God passed over the houses where the Israelites were and where the blood was. It's not just where the Israelites were, it's where the blood was. If you were an Israelite and didn't obey, guess what? This wasn't going to work for you. But this was a night in which God said He was going to go out into Egypt and visit the Egyptians. And it's the visitation of God and of His destroyer. Chapter 12, verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. God was going to visit. I'm coming to do this. But chapter 12 and verse 23, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. So God's there with, some people will consider it and call it the angel of death or something. I don't know what it is. It's the destroyer. This is the one who's with God, God and his destroyer. Come. This was a night of justice and vengeance from God. 3 texts on this, 1 in Genesis and 2 in Exodus. Let's look at Genesis chapter 15 and remember hundreds of years later when God told Abraham about what would happen. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 14, we read this. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. I will bring judgment on that nation. And then in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, we read, Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And then chapter 7 and verse 4, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. So God comes to judge, and with his destroyer, to enact judgment and to enact vengeance for his people. Now imagine, how sober would you be if I had told you that tonight in Hannibal, God was going to visit every house with judgment. And there would be a cry in the night such as never been in this town, nor will ever be again. This is the way God says, I'm going to come, I'm going to exercise my great acts of judgment, I'm going to come this night and execute judgment, I'm going to visit this place, and every house will be judged. And there's never been a moan and a wail and a cry like this in all of Egypt. You would be, I hope, absolutely terrified and humbled before God. But not only is God going to come, but God gives assurance of his protection from the destroyer to the Israelites. Right? He gives his assurance to the people of Israel that they can be exempted from the death of this night if they would follow his instructions. God assures them that he's willing that they would escape from the terrifying actions of this destroyer. His desire is to deliver them by using this plague of death. He would not allow the destroyer to harm the Israelites who had blood on the doors of their homes and who stayed inside their houses on this night of his vengeance. Now imagine, let's change the scenario up, but let's imagine if I had a dog who was trained to kill based upon scent. And it was based upon human scent. Everyone but my own, right? And then I took him on a walk through your neighborhood looking for people. Then you know that the dog is coming for you. But now imagine I told you that if you put ketchup all over your door and your windows and stayed in your house, the dog would not smell you. And he would keep going on to the next house, and your house would be safe. This is the sort of thing that's happening with these instructions of the Passover lamb. God is coming with his destroyer to go throughout all of Egypt that night and to visit every home. But he would rather you not suffer. And so, what does he do? He gives you instructions that when he passes through, when he sees this, he'll know that death has visited that house. The destroyer need not go there. And so he won't send the destroyer there. He won't, and if the destroyer were to go, he would, no, don't pay attention. You see there's blood there. You're not allowed to go in there. Find the next house. These are God's instructions. This is why you put the blood up. Because otherwise, you're going to die. God is coming with His destroyer to kill the firstborn in every house in the land. And there's one way to escape it. Which begs the question, why? I mean, I said ketchup, right? And we can imagine ketchup throwing off the scent of something. But like, why the blood of a lamb, a year old? Why this? Why is this, the death of a costly lamb and its blood spread over your door, a convincing sign to pass over the home? Well, the idea is that God is visiting the land of Egypt in a way that is not safe for anyone. Anyone not in the home also could die. If you're out on the streets this night, you could die. Any home not already visited by death, and with that death not evidenced by this lamb's blood upon the door, will suffer the judgment of God. This judgment is not because they did not kill the lamb. You're not judged because you didn't kill the lamb. You might not escape judgment because you didn't kill the lamb, but you're not going to be judged because you didn't kill the lamb. Does that make sense? Judgment is coming upon all the houses of Egypt. Rightly so. But you could be spared if you put this blood up and show death has already come here. Genesis 15, let's go back to Genesis 15 and look again at this. When God describes this judgment that would come. Genesis 15 and verse 14. We'll read down through verse 16. Verse 14, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." All of this has to do with sin, right? You're going to go there, you're going to be afflicted and treated harshly for 400 years, but I will judge them for their sin. And your descendants will come back here. But they will come back here not for a good long while. Why? Why will we wait to give them this land? Because the people that live here aren't yet wicked enough to deserve to be judged by me the way I'm going to do it. So we're going to wait until their sin reaches the full level. This is what I want to say. When God executes this judgment, whether upon the Amorites and the Canaanites in the land of Canaan, or whether upon the Egyptians later, or whoever He ever executes judgment on, He does it for their sins. He does it according to justice. He doesn't just decide, well, I like this group and not that group, therefore I'm going to mistreat this group and treat this one great. That's not what, He's no respecter of persons. And the God of justice, when He comes to enact judgment upon the nation of Egypt and to visit every household, you understand, there is no household that doesn't deserve judgment. Every household deserves judgment. And the people of Egypt were meant to think of it this way. In fact, and we'll get to this in a moment, but they used the word, we were spared. We were spared of the judgment this night. They were spared. Every house in the land, whether Egyptian or Hebrew, had sinned against God, and God was coming to execute justice in a measured way upon sinners. In an act of care and love for the people of Israel, He provided a way for them to escape that night of judgment, and this was the meaning of the blood of the Lamb. It was there to assure the destroyer that death had visited those inside. But for their sake, it was the blood of a substitute sacrifice. Somewhat similar to Noah and the ark, right? Judgment was coming. You think of Noah and the ark? Judgment was coming upon the world. Period. But in grace, God gave Noah a way to survive through it. Judgment is coming indiscriminately upon Egypt, but God is providing a way, despite this destroyer who's coming, for them to escape that destroyer, but only with the blood of this lamb. Only if the destroyer is convinced that death has visited that family already would he be satisfied to not go in. Judgment was coming upon the land of Egypt, indiscriminate judgment upon every household of sinners. That meant every household without exception. The only way to escape was to believe God concerning this sacrificial lamb and to act on that by carrying out His instructions and throwing the blood upon the door of your house and staying inside the doors of the home throughout the night. The destroyer had specific instructions from God to visit every house in Egypt with the death of the firstborn, unless there was already this lamb's blood upon the door in the places that God had directed. The primary message of the Passover is that God had provided a lamb as a substitute for judging them. Understand that. It is a sacrificial lamb. Their sinfulness was passed over by God when He accepted the blood of the lamb instead of the death of their firstborn son. Death came to the house, but it was the death of a spotless lamb and not their firstborn child. And what is the main connection to be made by the Israelites in the future as they keep this feast as a memorial of what God does for them this night? The ceremony is meant to be striking to those involved. They're meant to ask questions, especially the children, and to remember certain things as a people in the future. Let's look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 24 through 27. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you, for your sons forever, and when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as He has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children says to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For He passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when He struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshiped. We were spared. When God came to judge sinners in Egypt, we were spared. We were spared, not because we deserved it, but because God loved us. Now, God wasn't angry with us particularly, because, He came to judge the Egyptians because of their sin of not letting us go. But when He came to judge sin in Egypt, He spared us because He loved us. And He spared us in this way. He put this sacrificial lamb's blood on our doors. Our firstborn sons were spared. That word is so important to understand. Spared. Right? Meaning that according to what was happening that night and the way the Lord was killing in the land of Egypt, the Israelites deserved punishment as well. But instead of being punished as sinners, God spared them. God, in love and in faithfulness to His promises to their fathers, spared them that night of a deserved judgment in order that He might deliver them and possess them as a people unto Himself. The Passover lamb was not just a sign to God. It was that. Chapter 12, verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. It was a sign for them to God, but it was also a substitutionary death. It was a blood sacrifice, as it said, a sacrifice. And it is memorialized in the command to commemorate it every year in this way. It's interesting also, no foreigner or uncircumcised person may ever eat of the Passover. It belonged only to those united to God through the sign of circumcision. It was peculiar to Israel. And this is so because it was a memorial meal about the deliverance God made of His people to free them from oppression and to serve Him as His special people. It was, He did this, He spared them of this, and who did He spare? Only His people. And so when they commemorated, only His people are allowed to partake. Well, what if you were a foreigner? You can't partake. You say, well, I would like to partake of this. Well, this is only for those who have committed to the Lord as belonging to Him. And you do that in Israel through the sign of circumcision. So if you want to be circumcised, you can all be circumcised, and we'll welcome you in. You don't have to belong to ethnic Israel, but you have to be part of God's people in reality. And if you've gone through with this sign of circumcision, then you can partake. Otherwise, you shall not have it. One law in Israel. It's kind of amazing that it says it that way. that there shall be just one law in Israel? Because it says, only the circumcised can have it, not the uncircumcised. There's only one law. And you think, well, that's kind of two laws. But the law is, it's consistent, only the circumcised may eat the Passover. This belongs to them. And so that's the significance. How about the Feast of Unleavened Bread? And we'll revisit these, each one, as we go through, as we conclude, to summarize things and make it clear again. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what is the main connection to be made by the Israelites? What are they to be thinking of concerning this feast and the connection to what God has done? Well, let's look at chapter 13, verses 8 through 9. Again, we're changing over now from the Passover to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let me say this also. These things are so connected, not just by the things they signify or the events they signify, but also even in the history of Israel and even in your Bible, often the Passover is described as this day, the first day of the Day of Unleavened Bread, or the Day of Preparation. And it's like, what is that? Or sometimes you'll have the Feast of the Passover. There wasn't a Feast of the Passover. There was a festival of the Passover and the feast that followed, unleavened bread. But they're just put in there together because it's just kind of the same thing. Even though they're different, they have different reference, and you're to be having different conversations about their importance and what they signify. They're all talking about this deliverance, and they're even, one leads right into the next. So they're so connected. But this Feast of Unleavened Bread, chapter 13, verses 8 through 9. You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. So when you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they say, what is the meaning of this? You are supposed to say something like, verse 8, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. You think, well, what do you mean by that? And he says it a little bit clearer, I think, in the end of verse 9. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You're supposed to be conveying to them the strength of God's hand in bringing us out of Egypt. That's what this Feast of Unleavened Bread is meant to convey. How does lack of leaven convey the strength and power of God? That seems very strange. I don't think you would, if I were to ask you to come up with a religious symbol for the power of God, you would say lack of leaven. Like, who does that? No one does that, which is why your kids are going to be saying, what does this mean? I don't get it. Explain this to me. This seems like the most bizarre. All year long, we leaven our bread because that's better. Hello? And it lasts longer and it goes further. And then we have this week where we don't do any of that. And people are punished if they do. It's very serious. What is the point of this? Well, this has to do with the strength of God. What? God has delivered us with a strong hand, which makes no sense in a vacuum, but makes perfect sense in the context of this narrative, as we'll flesh out here in a moment. In these entire 2 chapters, the hurried nature of this deliverance, the rushed nature of it, is stressed over and over again. Look at chapter 12 and verse 11. This is they're commanded to eat the Passover lamb in this way and to eat of it forever in this way before they know why. Chapter 12, verse 11. In this manner you shall eat it. This is how you eat the Passover. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. We all know just from Jewish custom, what did they typically do in a house? They took off their feet, their shoes, not their feet, took off their shoes, and they washed their feet. And they went in. But this night, shoes on. But it's going to get the house dirty. Shoes on. Belt on. Belt on? Like, I'm not carrying anything with me. I don't need the belt. I don't need to have my outer garment. I'm in my house now. I can relax. I can take off the suit jacket, I'm not at work anymore. Nope. Put it on. You're fully dressed, ready to go. And staff in hand. In hand. I can't have it like by the door. In hand. You don't want to forget it. What? This is bizarre. They're being told this. They just have it all on and ready to go. and eat it quickly. I don't know if you've ever been to a Passover, to a Seder or whatever. They have these where, that's what it's called, the Passover meal. And I've been to some of these put on by Christians. This is amazing. Down in St. Louis, for Jews. Like they'll invite Jews that don't have somewhere they can go, and they come and bring them in. And they celebrate the Passover meal. And the whole time these Jews are sitting there, they're describing how all these Passover symbols point to Christ to them. It's like, it's the most bizarre thing. Like if I'm a Jew there, I'm thinking like, I'm sitting here eating this to observe Passover, listening to blasphemy. Like it's the weirdest thing. But they come and they listen. And it's evangelistic and it can be good. But the one thing I'll say about all that is nothing about it was hastily done. It didn't seem to be eaten in haste. We're talking about all these things and slowly doing this stuff. But this is supposed to be eaten in haste. So you got one hand here and the other hand, what? You're carving up the lamb. Here, hold this real quick. I got to grab this and eat. And you're just trying to eat quick and go through everything. This is the way it is. You think, why? Why is this? Well, it's got to be done in haste. You don't know yet why. Chapter 12, verse 16. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. As you celebrate it in your future, you're only allowed to do one thing. The only kind of work you're allowed to do is to just prepare the food that you've got to have. You've got to have that. You can't live without that. Well, you can make that. But you can't do anything else. Why? For 7 days? Like, this is bizarre. Chapter 12, verses 30 through 32. Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night. He didn't wait till the morning. Get them now. Get them here right now. Now, like they're sleeping. Now. Go. And so they come in the middle of the night. Get them up. Up. Go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Think about the difference in the way Pharaoh, all the other times, Moses said, and when should I go? When should I go make my offering? Go tomorrow. Go tomorrow. Tonight, get up now. Go. Get out of here. Go. It's incredible. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. How about the urgency of the people of Egypt? The next verse. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened. Why? They didn't choose to. They were forced to. They were driven out by the Egyptians. Get out. Their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks upon their shoulders. So you got a bunch of stuff to get. Like, what do you mean leave? I've got all kinds. I got my tools and all this stuff. Like, just go. You got to go. So what do? You lay out a big garment, throw a bunch of stuff in there, wrap it all up, twist it up, throw it on your shoulder, and you're gone. Take what supplies you can carry and go. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Let's keep reading on to verse 41 and see this. Notice the haste that this is done with. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Don't just read that as, oh, that's a number. Think about this for a second, visually. 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, plus a mixed multitude who also went up with them, with very much livestock, flocks and herds, and you're all just supposed to get out of there tonight, now, go. There's not time. Go. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened. They didn't have to, it's a couple day long process to do that. They didn't have time to do that. Because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait. They would prefer to wait and pack all their stuff and get everything neatly organized and bring the leavened bread, but they couldn't do that, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. They just left. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. at the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now, I don't think this means, and I'm okay if you think it means this, but I don't think it means that they went in on the 15th day of this month or whatever, and then 430 years later on the 15th day of the month they went out again. I think the idea is this. You need to understand, they were in slavery for 430 years, and things were never going to change. And when God decided to act, that very day they went out. Just like that. Just gone. That night he says, this is what we're going to do. And before the next night, they're all out of Egypt. They've got all the stuff with them. They plundered the Egyptians. They're free. And just like that. So when we celebrate this day and we don't have any leaven for this week, and you think, why don't we do this? I want to tell you, with a strong hand, God brought us out. You see the connection here? What a strong and mighty hand. Verse 51. Or how about verse 50? All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. By their hosts, by their masses. He brought them all out on that very day. They did everything they were told to do. They did the Passover just right, just like God told them. And that very day He brought them out. That's what the leaven signifies. That it was so sudden when God delivered us. When God was, God kept telling Moses, go in there and tell him to let you go. But it's not time yet. I don't want him to let you go yet, so it's not going to work. And so there's this long, drawn-out process. But it wasn't this long process so that God could finally win over the battle. He wanted it a certain way. But once He said, okay, now He's going to let you go, and watch how fast it happens. And they were gone in a day. It's amazing. Like, when you heard the announcement, you never laid your head on your pillow again. You never slept in that bed again after you heard the announcement. That night, you kept the feast of the Passover. In the middle of the night, people were getting up and saying, get out of here. You gather all the things that you can and you go. You're out. Free. God exercised great judgment upon Egypt, but when it was time to deliver, He did it all in one day. Remember, the Jews count their days differently than we do. They begin their days at sundown. So the night of the Passover is that day. Right? That night, they're supposed to do what? Kill the lamb. And before the next night comes, they're all gone. So in one day, the whole thing happened. In a 24-hour period, listen to this, God promised a just judgment upon the people of the land. He ensured a way of escape from judgment for the Israelites that required some planning and effort to carry it out. He turned the hearts of all the Egyptians toward the Israelites to get them out of the land and to give them anything they asked for in the process, thereby plundering the Egyptians in additional judgment. He visited the land with severe judgment upon the firstborn. He had Pharaoh summon Moses to give him orders to leave immediately. He had the people of Egypt thrust them out for fear of death of all of them. And He moved millions of people of Israel out of Egypt together with a mixed multitude of those who sought to follow them and serve their God. All in a day, that very day, He did it. Moved them out by their hosts. And so the significance is not just that God delivered them with a strong hand, but that when He acted, He was able to bring it all about in a single day. They were free and out of Egypt in one day. 430 years of slavery, freedom in a day. You can't, think in our country, when we decided to end slavery, all the talk was like, well, you can't just end it. You couldn't just end it suddenly. What would we do? They wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't be able to live. Well, God figured that out. You'll have plenty because they'll give you everything they own. They'll just say, what do you want? Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. You'll be rich. You'll have all kinds of livestock. You'll be set. One of the reasons in Israel, when you release a slave, you don't just let him go. You give him all kinds of stuff because God did that for you when you left Egypt. That's why it's a law in Israel. Just like that, He set them out. And you can't help but feel that way when you read about the haste here and the reason they had unleavened bread in the first place. They weren't allowed to go get it. They had to get out of there. They were driven out. God's hand was strong, not just in that He displayed mighty acts, but in just how quickly He got them out, like it was nothing. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that we'd say, like, if there's a boxer or a boxing match and, might say, well, how was the fight? Like, it's first round knockout. You think, not much of a fight. That one guy was much better than the other. Right? This is how it goes. Well, this was a one-night knockout. Right? God said, it's time, it's over. We're all out. It wasn't hard. The God's strong hand. Now, redemption of the firstborn. I don't have near as much on this one. We must remember that the judgment came upon Egypt that night. That judgment was the judgment of a just God visiting judgment upon sinners. Therefore, everyone deserved judgment. But instead of being punished as sinners, God spared the people of Israel. God, in love and in faithfulness to His promise to their fathers, spared them that night of a deserved judgment, in order that He might deliver them and possess them as a people unto Himself. This was true of all of Israel. They were all spared the agony of sorrow, but especially a firstborn son whose very life was spared. It's especially true, it's true of all of Israel that God spared them this sorrow, but it's especially true if you're a firstborn son that you've been spared, because you were the target that night. Oh, for the lamb. Dad, find a lamb. We got to get a lamb. We got an hour. We got to get a lamb. I'm the firstborn. Let me read two passages, individual verses from Numbers. You can turn there if you like. In the context, they're actually in the context of God changing this law a little bit about who would be serving Him. But it's important to understand these verses as they stand, because this is God's commentary about what He's doing when He rescues these firstborn and spares them. Numbers 3:13. Numbers chapter 3 and verse 13. For all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated for my own all the firstborn in Israel, both of man and of beast. They shall be mine. I am the Lord. Or Numbers chapter 8 and verse 17, almost the same thing said. Numbers 8:17, for all the firstborn among the people of Israel are mine, both of man and of beast. On the day that I struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated them for myself. So we could say this. Therefore, the firstborn belong to God. They are His. And because of that, they must be redeemed in order to be free. So here's the idea. Your firstborn son deserves to die. And you can't really spare him. There's nothing you could offer me for him. Right? But I want him as my own. So I'm telling you, take that lamb, kill it, offer the blood, put it up there, and then I won't kill him. But the lamb was mine too. And I have purchased your son with the lamb. He's mine. When I spared his life, I bought him as mine. It's like you have a choice. You didn't realize it, but as your king, I'm telling you, you had a choice. You could slaughter your son, or you could be a party of your son being slaughtered by the destroyer, or you could give him to me for service forever. Will he come serve me? You remember that was the whole goal of the whole people of Israel to come out in the beginning anyway, was to come serve God. God was rescuing them to put them in service to Him and in relationship to Him. And that is especially true of those firstborn sons who were spared by God for that purpose. The sad thing is, what we read about in Numbers, is because of the golden calf and other things, think of this, initially, God, the temple service, it would have been imagined as every family's firstborn son served at the temple. What that would have been, served as a priest. But they were rejected because of their sin, and God chose the Levites instead because of their zeal for God. And we actually read, there's a passage, right, where the whole shekel of the temple is talked about, where number all the firstborn in Israel, 22,000, I think 300 and whatever. And then number all the kids, the males of the Levites from like 1 month up to whatever the age. 22,000, the difference of whatever the number is. Okay, tell the people of Israel they got to pay that difference. I am redeeming for you, your sons, all your firstborn sons have to be redeemed. This is how we're going to redeem it. Every Levite for your son. You can have your son back. I don't need him for service. I want a Levite instead. And for the ones that there's not enough, if your son's going to live, and by law you must redeem him, because I don't really want to kill him, you have to pay for that one. But then throughout all their history, they have to redeem these sons with a price. When they get to be 30 days old or a month old, you have to go what? You have to go and pay for them. And it's a law. You must redeem them. You must pay for them. If your son is not going to be killed, you have to pay. You have to pay God because he belongs to God, rightly. If he's not going to be killed or if he's not going to be put into God's service, you have to buy him back. And so they had to buy them all back. Why? Why do that? Well, let's look. Verse 13 of chapter 13. Every firstborn of a... second half of 13, we can pick up there. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand and frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So the animals, so those things that are not your firstborn sons, the firstborn of everything else, you can sacrifice that to the Lord. Offer that to God. But your son you have to redeem. And this is what God did for Israel. He redeemed them, and he redeemed their firstborn sons. So, firstborn belong to God. They are his, and because of that, they have to be redeemed. That's what this practice is all about, to remember the way that the people of Israel are the firstborn of God and what he did for the firstborn. 3 customs we read about: the Passover, unleavened bread, and redemption of the firstborn. Now, I said I would be happy if you could, in your own words, state how these things, what they signify. And because we've gone through them and I've just laid them out and not restated them, I don't expect you to do that now, so let me do that for you, and then hopefully you can carry that with you. The Passover, what does it signify? How does it signify this night in the redemption and the deliverance of the people of Israel? The Passover, we could say this: the repeated sacrifice and the meal remind them clearly of the original sacrifice to spare them of judgment because of God's love and promise. Right? I mean, it's pretty clear. We have this, we kill the animal again, we put its blood out, we eat it in a certain way. It reminds us of what happened that night when God actually did. It's not that they had to, it's not like every time they did this Passover, God and the destroyer went through Israel. This is a remembrance, a memorial about what had happened in the past. And so it reminds them of that original Passover and the way that God had used this sacrifice to be the thing that preserved them from this judgment. And God gave them that because of his love for them. Right? Here's a sacrifice. It'll be a sign between me and you. When I see that blood, I'll pass over. So because of his love and his promise to them, he provided them with the sacrifice to save them from judgment. That's the Passover. How about the unleavened bread? It was to remind them of a hasty departure from Egypt and of God's power to deliver even from Egypt in a single day. Even in a single day. The strong arm of God. How about redemption of the firstborn? Well, this repeated act of redemption or a sacrifice of an animal reminds them of the purpose of God for saving. God saves to put you in His service and to put you in relationship to Him. He saves you, He redeems you as a firstborn unto Him to be in His service and in relationship to Him. Redemption of the firstborn. Those three things. Now, how do these ideas come together to teach us about God? Some things might be evident in terms of the strength of God. That seems obvious, that kind of thing. Some about His character we've learned. But let's just say this first. They were spared from judgment by a sacrificial lamb. So blood is a necessary result of sin. Or as the New Testament says, right, the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. Blood is necessary. Without blood, no sin is forgiven. But in love, God is willing to spare those who trust in His promises that they could be spared. He's actually willing to spare them through what He provides, a sacrificial lamb. It becomes so important, does it not? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. It's like, yeah, that's what we're talking about. We need that. What else? God's judgment and deliverance comes suddenly, even with warning. Even when He warns you ahead of time, this is what's going to come, get ready, it's still so sudden you don't have time for anything else. Just get out, go, grab what you can carry. There's nothing else you can do. God does not need a long process to deliver or to judge. He might patiently prepare the world for His action, but when He acts, He's more than capable of reversing your entire known world in a single day. It's incredible. Like you can't tell me there was a slave in Egypt who thought, tomorrow morning I could be free. Like actually out of Egypt. They might have thought, tomorrow the Egyptians will change their tune and they'll say, hey, you guys start getting ready, you can get out of here. But nobody thought, this is like you've had your last night of sleep in Egypt. Nobody realized that. Even though God told them, I'm here to deliver. Nobody was expecting that. It has happened. Does that not sound familiar? Right? Like a thief in the night. Like He can tell us, He can warn us so that we're not surprised, but He says it's going to come that way. Everyone's going to be surprised. Now you can be prepared. You can have your staff in hand and your belt fastened. You can eat in haste. You can be ready to pack up and go. But it's still going to surprise you when it happens. It's just going to come like that. There's no, oh, here it comes, now let me get ready. It's too late. You don't have time to get the leaven. You don't have time to make preparations. That's not how it is. God's judgment and deliverance come, when they come, swiftly. What else? Well, when God spares a person of His judgment, which they deserve, and provides for their escape, and makes a payment for their sin, He's not just paying for sin, He's at the same time laying a claim to their life and their future service. He says, when I spared them, I bought them. Think of that. God views it that way. If I spare you from what you deserve, you owe me your life. I've bought your service. Because with God, it's not just what I could have done to you, it's what rightly you deserve to have happened to you. But I spared you, and I paid the price. I provided the substitute. Therefore, you owe the one who made payment for you. Right? If you owe a debt of $1 million to somebody and you can't pay it, and I pay the $1 million, I might just say, here, just let him go. Here's the $1 million. That doesn't matter to me. But I might say, in this culture, it's this way. You owe this person $1 million, and you are their slave. You're indentured to them. And I say, actually, let me not just give you some money. Let me pay this servant I want that servant. I'm going to pay their debts. And I've paid your debt, and now your debt is on to me. Right? You're a debtor to me. This is the way this works in terms of finances and stuff. Well, here it is. I don't mean to say this is exactly what happens in salvation with our sins, like we somehow, we got to repay God for all this debt. But the idea is you've been put into a new connection now. You were related to that person as a debtor and a slave, and now you're now in another situation. Now you're bound to God. He's paid for these things for you. He's freed you. When God spares you of judgment, which you deserve, and pays for your sin, He is laying claim to your life and future service. 1 Corinthians 7, 19 through 20. You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So, glorify God with your body. Right? You're not your own. What do you mean I'm not? I'm my own boss. No, you're not. You were bought with a price. You've been paid for. Well, if I've been paid for, if I've been purchased, what should I do? Well, you should glorify God with your body. You should honor the one who purchased you from such a debt so graciously. That's what you should do. The last thing I want to say here, and I promise it's not connected to Father's Day, but in some ways it is, I guess. We just could say this from what we read here. There is an importance and a certain expectation that God has toward parents, and especially fathers, to instruct their children in the things of God. The old commentators would say, here in this chapter, in these two chapters, and other places too, but here is a warrant for catechizing your children. Right? For putting them through things and say, well, what does this mean? Well, let me explain this. Now you ask the next question, and I tell you this. And we just go through. Like, I don't know that I would say, take a catechism and say that's what this is talking about or giving a warrant for, but certainly this idea that fathers and parents, but especially fathers, ought to be taking it upon themselves to wear this mantle of teaching their children about the great acts of God in history and about the character and nature of God now and about the ownership that God rightly has on their life and what that means for them. Like, surely that applies. We just see that here. It's a big deal. And this was a command. It shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes. You see? Why do we got to keep keeping these ceremonies? And every time I have an animal has a first offspring, I got to go kill it or buy it back. Or if it's a kid, we got to go make this offering. What is all this about? God wants this repeatedly done in Israel again and again and again. He wants it to be as if it's a mark on your hand. Or frontlets between everywhere you go, it's kind of in your vision. You see it, it's in your mind. You can't get away from it, you can't escape it. That's why these practices existed again and again and again and again for them. He wanted them to remember all that He did to constitute them as a nation, freeing them out of Egypt, delivering them. The strong hand of God, how suddenly it happened. The sacrifice necessary to spare their firstborn. And then the implication of being a purchased firstborn. What does that mean? Who do you belong to? Who do you serve? What's the purpose of your life? This is the significance, the day of significance. This is what's important. These are the things God wanted them to remember and to know and to never get away from. Well, that's all I have on the message today. We will, next few times I speak, still be talking about some of these things. Like there's a lot of stuff here. There's some things that are said, maybe the way they're said, that I feel like is a very helpful way to think about certain topics, and so we'll be here for a little while longer. Are there any questions or comments on anything that we've shared today?